Okay, class, this is going to be the helper video or the examples video for chapter 12, the Keynesian perspective. So there were a couple of things I wanted to go over with you all. So one of those was essentially the short-run aggregate supply curve in this model. It's a little bit, so I guess when we had, so the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model before price stickiness. So if you remember what that model looked like, we had, GDP, price level. Let's say here's the long run aggregate supply curve. Here's aggregate demand. And then if you remember, the short run aggregate supply curve did something like this. All right? And we would get the equilibrium price level would be there, and the current level of equilibrium output coincided with the long run potential level of GDP. But let's say that aggregate demand actually fell for whatever reason. Households decided to not consume as much. Maybe businesses didn't want to invest as much. Maybe government spending was cut. So the equilibrium moved to this point here, and we ended up with a decrease in output. But look, we also had a decrease in the price level that was brought about because if you notice, the short-run aggregate supply curve is actually downward sloping here. So if there's less output, not only does it mean that we're going to have less, so if there's less demand, not only does it mean we're going to have less production and therefore less output, but producers are going to respond and you're going to get a decrease in prices because, again, producers respond to prices here. That's why there's a slope to this short-run aggregate supply curve. And you might not get as much of a decrease in output had prices remained the same, which is what happens in the Keynesian framework. So here we do get prices falling, but we also get a little bit of a suppressed decrease in output because firms do respond to the prices that are falling. They say prices are falling, it's not that profitable, I'm not going to produce anything. All right? So compare and contrast that now with the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. And this would be like the Keynesian flavor. And now with price stickiness. So again, let's make our graph here. Output, price level, long run aggregate supply curve. Oops, long run aggregate supply curve. Aggregate demand curve. Now, we're dealing with the short run here with the Keynesian focus. And so the short run aggregate supply curve does this. It moves this way, and then it goes up alongside the long run aggregate supply curve. So there's also the short run aggregate supply curve is here. So now what you'll see is if there is a decrease in aggregate demand, let's say about the same amount here, all right, output falls Oops, I forgot a couple of things here. I didn't label my graph. So here, this is output, and this is the price level. So what you can see here is that output actually falls a lot more than it did over here. Because again, this is not the super short run, right? It's not the short run under the lens of Keynes, at least. Keynes said there's price stickiness. And so here we don't have that price stickiness. And you can see that with the decrease in output, there is a decrease in prices. Firms respond by producing less. And you don't get as much of a decrease in output, right? Here, you get the full-fledged decrease in demand. I should say, it's not that firms produce less, it's that people aren't decreasing their demand as much, right? Because if prices are falling, people want to buy more things. So you don't get as much of a decrease in output. Here, there's less of a demand, but prices are still high. They're still the same. So you're not going to get nearly as many people wanting to buy things as you were before. And now you get a big amplified decrease in output. And of course, like we say, unemployment resides between equilibrium and the long run aggregate supply curve. So you can see that the unemployment reaction here is also a lot greater than it was here, right? Big difference there, okay? So again, primary difference between the regular aggregate demand, aggregate supply model and the Keynesian version of that is we got a flat short run aggregate supply curve, and that is indicative of, again, price stickiness. That's what rules the roost here, all right? Okay. So the other thing I wanted to go over once again was this, these two pictures here in the textbook where, again, we not only have price stickiness in the goods market, but we also have, wage stickiness in the labor market, okay? And here you can see that if you have both wage and price stickiness, you're going to definitely get a bigger response to unemployment if wages aren't allowed to come down to clear the market, right? Here we have a surplus, but if the wage is stuck, that surplus is going to be stuck with us for a very long time. And this surplus here in the labor market represents unemployment. These are people that want to supply their labor to a company. They want to get a job and supply their labor, but there's just not enough demand. There aren't enough jobs for them. And that's by definition where we call unemployed. You're looking for a job, you want to supply your labor, but there's just no jobs available for you. And again, here we know the similar story with the goods market, all right? Prices are sticky in the goods market, and again, you get a decrease in demand. You get this excess supply or excess inventory that hasn't been sold because there's just not enough demand there. And this is one of the reasons why with the Keynesian prescription to all of this is to try to influence the demand curves to shift to the right? Increase that government spending, right? Get those demand curves moving to try to get them back to where they were before, stabilize that demand, right? So the other thing I wanted to go over with you all was this derivation of the Phillips curve. Now, we did something like this in class, but I think it's very worthwhile to go over this step by step, especially those of you who haven't seen it. All right. So again, we're going to be looking towards now a couple of pictures here. So this will be, let's start off with a aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. And so for this one, we can just use a plain old vanilla aggregate demand, aggregate supply model where we're not going to do any type of fancy curves at all. So this is the long run aggregate supply curve. Here's aggregate demand. Here's short run aggregate supply. And the reason why we're not doing the fancy curves is because that's not going to help what we're trying to do here. And so if it's not going to help, then why do we want to even carry that extra weight around? All right, we want the bare minimum to get exactly what we need to understand. All right, and here I'm going to draw a graph that's going to have cyclical unemployment on the x-axis and inflation on the y-axis, right? And we're going to start off at 0 and 0. So the first point here is going to be right there. We don't have a curve yet, so this will be our Phillips curve. All right, but we do know that cyclical unemployment is equal to 0 because the current equilibrium is right on the long-run aggregate supply curve, right? And prices haven't really moved anywhere, so the inflation rate, by implication, is equal to 0. All right, so let's go ahead and start shifting that aggregate demand curve a little bit. So let's say we shift it over here to the right. And we end up with a level of output way up there. Y star, P star. Okay. So what type of cyclical unemployment is this consistent with? Because we're producing at a level of output to the right of potential GDP, which is the long-run aggregate supply curve, cyclical unemployment is going to be less than 0. Okay? And so that's going to be a point on the Phillips curve that's somewhere around here. All right? Cyclical unemployment less than 0. Again, don't forget, when cyclical unemployment is equal to 0, it means that the unemployment rate's equal to the natural rate of unemployment. Right? Now, what about inflation? If we look closely, we can see that the new price level is higher than the old price level, and that's going to be a positive rate of inflation. So that's going to be inflation up over here. So if we connect these 2 points together, that's going to be consistent with a point over here. Okay? Now let's go ahead and shift the aggregate demand curve to the left. Let's say down this way. All right. So now output is located over here, and we have Y star and P star. Okay, now what kind of unemployment, cyclical unemployment, is consistent with output to the left of potential? So now the economy is producing below its potential level. It means that cyclical unemployment is going to be positive, right? And what about inflation? Well, look, prices fell. This price level is below both of those. So if that means, if we calculate the inflation rate, it's going to be this price level minus that price level, or that one, divided by whichever one we decide. But since this one's lower than both of them, that's going to be negative. So the inflation is going to be below 0 for that equilibrium there. And when we connect those 2 points together, we get a point out over here. So as you can see, as we sweep from left to right with this aggregate demand curve, we're going to get points that go up and down this Phillips curve. So when we connect these points together, that's going to be what our Phillips curve is. So that's our Phillips curve. All right, now your textbook doesn't derive this like this, but I like deriving things from our models that we know, and if this aggregate demand, aggregate supply model can provide us with that, why not? That's the way I look at it. Okay, so shifts in the aggregate demand curve move us along the Phillips curve. All right. So when we shift that aggregate demand curve, we're going to be moving up and down this curve. All right. Now, what could potentially cause this curve to shift? That'll be our next point of contention here. So let's go ahead and draw both of those graphs again. Output, price level, potential GDP, or long-run aggregate supply as we call it, aggregate demand, short-run aggregate supply, initial equilibrium prices, and initial equilibrium output. And to the right, we're going to put our Phillips curve, cyclical unemployment, inflation. We're going to start off at 0 for both because nothing's changing. All right. And from before, we know that the Phillips curve is downward sloping because we already derived it. All right. But this is where we're starting. This is the point that we're starting off at now. But we already know if we shift this aggregate demand curve to the right and to the left, we're just going to move this point up and down this line. Okay. But I'm going to throw a monkey wrench in this, and I'm going to say, all right, we know what happens when the short-run aggregate demand curve, I'm sorry, short-run aggregate demand curve, I'm making up all kinds of stuff. We know what happens when the aggregate demand curve shifts to the right and to the left. That just moves us up and down the curve. But what happens when the short-run aggregate supply curve shifts to the right and to the left? All right. For example, what happens if this short-run aggregate supply curve shifts left as a result of an increase in the price of oil, an increase in the price of raw materials, something that makes production more expensive? We're going to end up producing up here, output is below potential, but we have prices now have risen. Right? So now, what kind of unemployment coincides with output that's below potential? This is going to be positive cyclical unemployment. Okay. But look at what we have here with the inflation rate, though. The new price level is higher than the old price level, which means inflation is going to be positive. Okay, because it's going to be red P star minus black P star divided by black P star. So inflation's positive. Now what happens when we connect those 2 points together? We get a point that's not on that old Phillips curve. It's out here. So in fact, if we now leave the short-run aggregate supply curve there, and we now once again start shifting the aggregate demand curve about the new short-run aggregate supply curve, we're going to get a whole new set of points and thus a whole new Phillips curve. Okay? In fact, that tells us the Phillips curve shifted out to the right. Now, what would happen if we had the exact opposite scenario? Let's say that there was a decrease in the price of energy, or we discovered plentiful oil here in the US that was even better than what we import from overseas. So let's call this short-run aggregate supply curve double prime, and that brought this equilibrium out down that way now. All right, we have an increase in output, Y star, and we in fact now have a decrease in prices because production has become cheaper. And as a result, we produce a lot more, creates a surplus, that puts pressure on prices on average to fall. What kind of unemployment is associated with this equilibrium level of output here? We're producing at a level of output above potential, which means unemployment is going to be less than 0. But we also have an inflation rate, which now is negative because orange P star minus black P star divided by black P star is negative. So our inflation is going to be below zero as well. And when we connect those 2 points together, we get this point over here. And once again, if we were to shift the aggregate demand curve about this new short-run aggregate supply curve, we would trace out a whole new set of points out this way. And we can see that that caused the Phillips curve to shift inwards. All right. So now what's the conclusion to this simple exercise or this experiment here? It's twofold. Right? Again, shifts in the aggregate demand curve. That's movements along the Phillips curve. Shifts in the short-run aggregate supply curve. Those will shift the Phillips curve. All right. Now make sure you don't confuse those two. Okay. Just make sure you don't confuse them, because you might be asked this on your next exam or on an exam in the future. And, we went through the trouble of deriving this thing, so let's make sure we don't screw this up, right? Let me take a look and see if there's any type of examples that are worth going over. So let's see here. So here we can see, if you take a look here at number 5, this one that I circled is a good one. How would a decrease in energy prices affect the Phillips curve? All right, look at that close. How would a decrease in energy prices affect the Phillips curve? We showed that here. It's the orange. It's the orange equilibrium. So it's what corresponds to orange here. A decrease in oil prices or a decrease in energy prices shifts the short-run aggregate supply curve to the right. Okay? And we see here that the Phillips curve, as a result, is going to shift to the left. Okay? So, easy question to answer because we already did the homework here for that. Not many other questions here. We can do one quick example of fiscal policy here. So here we can look at this other one that I circled. In a Keynesian framework using an aggregate demand aggregate supply diagram, which of the following government policy choices offer a possible solution to a recession? Which offer a possible solution to inflation? All right. So if we have a recession, again, we're going to want to stimulate the economy, okay? Because by definition, a recession would be a point much like this figure here in your textbook on page 313. We can see that here, this is the aggregate demand curve that's consistent with a recession. And so what are we going to want to do? We're going to want to shift this aggregate demand curve to the right somehow. If you remember from the lecture video, how do we shift the aggregate demand curve to the right? We either increase government expenditure, so we get an increase in G, or we get a decrease in taxes. Because an increase in G, that's just going to increase G and aggregate demand is going to increase. A decrease in taxes is going to increase consumption and maybe even increase investment. So C plus I is going to go up, and then that's also going to shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. So that question, so for recessions, you know that a tax increase is not going to help. A surge in military spending, that's an increase in G, that will help. A reduction in business taxes, that increase investment, that's also going to help, right? That's an increase in G, that's an increase in I. And then a major increase in what the U.S. government spends on healthcare, that's an increase in G, that will also help. So what about this part A here, a tax increase on consumer income? So that's what you would do if you found yourself at a point like over here on this aggregate demand curve, right? This one is the one that's creating a little bit of inflation. That's why we have a lowercase I here. And what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to shift that aggregate demand curve to the left. So how are you going to shift it to the left? Increase taxes on consumers. They have less money to spend on goods and services. That's going to decrease consumption, and you're going to get your decrease in aggregate demand and a lowering of inflation, right? Just as we asked. Okay. I'll put some more problems on the to-do list for you all to practice, but that's those are the examples I wanted to go over. And any questions, feel free to reach out by email. All right. Bye now.